Welcome, everybody. I hope the folks out there on this panel and on the call are in good health, good spirits, preferably both. I'm Sheldon Himmelfarb. I'm the CEO of the Peace Tech Lab in Washington, D.C. We're an independent nonprofit organization that was spun out from the U.S. Institute of Peace over 6 years ago. And our mission, simply put, is to amplify the power of technology to prevent violent conflict and to build peace in the US and around the world, to essentially promote a culture where we use these everyday tools, our phones, our laptops, our social media, the internet, where we use them for positive social change. Now, as a practical matter, that means we work with activists around the world for whom the internet is a lifeline. This is how they mobilize. This is how they raise money. This is how they share ideas. So we are really, really familiar with how important free expression is to those that we work with, those activists we work. We're really aware of how the anonymity that they have in authoritarian regimes can make the difference between life and death for them. At the same time, we in the lab also, we work in Myanmar, we work in Nigeria, we work extensively in South Sudan. So we are also mindful of how the information environment has led to so much harm, hatred, deaths from the platforms being utilized that way. So we really do have a perspective in both senses. And what I love about having this conversation today is bringing the peace builders' perspective to a debate which we all know is raging. You'd have to be living under a rock not to know that big changes are coming in this information environment, whether it's regulatory or the tech companies themselves offering to greater levels of transparency. Change is going to happen. And we as peace builders have to make sure that the baby doesn't get thrown out with the bathwater. We want a seat at the table as these changes are being discussed. So this conversation today is extremely timely, and I am really, really honored to have this group of extraordinary individuals, each of whom represents a very, very different perspective to help me in this conversation. Before we dive in, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the Alliance for Peacebuilding and USRA and the whole PeaceCon team. We have loved being a part of PeaceCon for the last several years, and I am just so happy that you guys were able, even in this 2020, to make it happen again. You've managed to keep this important event going. So thank you all very much for that. Now, let's jump into this discussion today. Fake news is information, misinformation, disinformation. We all know it's been around for a long time. Anybody who works in conflict zones knows this is not a new problem. The first thing that goes out the window in conflict is reliable information. But it has taken on a new contour, if you will. The volume and velocity with which this misinformation spreads is extraordinary. Its prevalence, the risk factors involved, as I've already sort of intimated. And I've come to believe personally that this is one of the greatest threats to our democracy. And others, you may know the name Tim Wu, who was the guy that developed net neutrality theory. He's referred to the use of intense disinformation as the information version of a second civil war. I've heard others refer to it as the internet's version of global warming. So countless folks in policy and tech and government and in the nonprofit sector are bringing focus to the severity of this problem and crying out reforms. So it's a nuanced, complex topic that would take days, if not months, to properly define and explore. But I think we've got a really nice metaphor, if you will, in digital wildfires. which was a term that was coined in 2013 by the World Economic Forum. I want to give credit where credit is due. Uh, it's a useful umbrella term, I think, because it refers to the speed and the severity of the harmful content that we've seen spreading online, again, under the heading of misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and so forth. This digital wildfires, I think it conveys the urgency and the destructiveness of this problem. But it also implies action. It suggests that there are things we can do with tools, with awareness, with training, that we can all do to help put out these fires in becoming digital smoke jumpers. And again, that's why I'm really happy to have this panel here, and I'm going to jump right into it if I can with each of them. Let me ask each of you, because you do bring such unique perspective, just very quickly, introduce yourselves. We've got Nick D'Onofrio, we've got Michelle Lipkin, we've got Gurmahar Karg, who is there in India now, and we've got Phil Howard in the UK. I want to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and just very briefly say, why is this topic important to you? So let me go, if I might, go first to you, Nick, and start us off.
Sure. Thanks, Sheldon. Great introduction. Hello, everyone. My best wishes to everyone, and I hope everyone is well and safe. I'm probably the oldest person here. I'm 75 years old. I had nearly a 45-year career at IBM, graduated from IBM in 2008, and I'm having a ball doing a number of other things. I happen to also be the chairman of the Peace Tech Lab Board. So my job is to kind of keep Sheldon in line and keep him on point. And most of you are laughing right now on this panel because you know that's just not possible. Although we're doing pretty well at that. I'd have to say my background is technology. That's what I did at IBM. I was an honest to God electrical engineer, circuit designer. I did real work for a living at one time. That hasn't happened in a very long time. But I'm pretty savvy with what's going on. And everything that Sheldon said in his introduction is point on. You're going to hear from me in just a few minutes. I actually would add, it's not just that all this goes on in the far reaches of the world. It actually happens to you, where you are today. And it happened to me earlier this year. And I'll be sharing that with you in just a few minutes. So I'll stop here in the sake of time and brevity, and back to you, Sheldon.
Perfect, Nick. Perfect. Thank you. And let me go to Michelle. Michelle, how about a quick introduction of yourself?
Sure. So my name is Michelle Chulipkin, and I am the executive director of the National Association for Media Literacy Education. I'm based in New York City, where I'm also an adjunct lecturer at Brooklyn College, where I teach media literacy to journalism students. And prior to my work as a media literacy educator, I worked in children's television. So I come from all of this from a media creation point of view and frame. And I also had various leadership roles in the New York City public school system, which allowed me also to understand the education system through a very large lens in New York City. And just to give you a little information about our organization, so we call ourselves Namely, and we are the largest membership organization for those practicing and passionate about media literacy education around the globe. And our vision is very broad, but very clear. Our vision is to see media literacy education highly valued and widely practiced as an essential life skill in the 21st century. So I come to the issue of misinformation and disinformation from the media literacy frame. And certainly this conversation has been one that is very prevalent to media literacy education space, and certainly since 2016. In a lot of ways, this conversation put media literacy kind of on the map and into cultural conversation, and has really shown the urgency of the work that we do. So I have a lot more to say about that, but I will leave it there and pick it up after as we're in the discussion. And thank you so much, Sheldon, for having me. And I'm looking really forward to the conversation.
What a pleasure. So we have a technologist, we have an educator, and let me turn to Phil now. Phil, introduce yourself.
Phil, you're on mute.
You're muted, Phil. Sorry, you got to unmute yourself. There you go.
Hi, I'm Phil Howard. I'm a professor at Oxford University, and I thought I'd just offer Sheldon the minute and the 90-second version about how I got into this topic. I was living in Budapest in the summer of 2014 when the Malaysian Airlines flight was shot down over Ukraine, and I watched my Hungarian friends get three kinds of ridiculous stories about what was going on. There was the story that American soldiers had shot it down because they were supposedly operating in Ukraine. There was the story that democracy advocates had shot the plane down because they thought Putin was on the plane flying commercial from Amsterdam to Malaysia. And then there was the story of the lost tank from World War II that had been stuck in the forests of Ukraine and had come out confused and accidentally shot the plane down. And it's at that point that I realized that the strategy here was not about trying to plant one story, one narrative of misinformation, but it's about planting multiple, conflicting, sometimes equally ridiculous stories. And what's really surprised me over the years is to see how this has gone from being something that authoritarian leaders do to their own people, to being something that authoritarian leaders do to voters in the West, and then to becoming something that politicians in the West do to their own citizens. So that's what got me into this thing as an area of research, and unfortunately, the problem's only gotten bigger over time. The wildfires have spread.
What a great way to pull us all in, Phil, to the nature of this problem. But Phil forgot to mention that he is also the current head of the Oxford Internet Institute. So he's surrounded by some tremendous minds. I've been a huge fan of the work that's going on there in all kinds of different vectors. Let's go to Gurmahar, who is there in India, in between cities, traveling. Gurmahar, introduce yourself, please. I imagine Phil's kind of teeing up multiple narratives. You probably see, orders of magnitude of narratives around some of the same stories, but introduce yourself, please.
Thank you so much, Sheldon, for having me here, and thank you everyone for speaking before me. I'm Gurmahar Kaur. I am the Global Ambassador for Digital Peace now, and I'm an activist and a writer in India. I think for me, it's an extremely important issue that I'm personally very interested in because of the things that we have seen just in the recent past. We've seen a global pandemic with absolutely unclear dates of when it's going to end. And we've seen the Black Lives Matter movements. We've seen this worldwide reckoning of just of systematic injustice and racism. And as we are witnessing these moments in history, we're also consuming a lot of information and disinformation. So this mis and disinformation travels through the internet via our connected devices. It spreads primarily through the internet on our social channels, through group chats, emails, and as my generation, everyone earlier than me, we have grown up with access to this information from the beginning, and it feels like it's everywhere all the time. So it's this inescapability which makes me extremely interested in solving it. And I genuinely believe that this issue needs to be tackled now, because we have to create a global framework to solve the spread of this misinformation, because we're at very nascent stages of creating the internet infrastructure. The infrastructure is still being built and designed and updated, and this is a moment where we're able to come together and create a global consensus on how we can protect this internet infrastructure from malicious actors.
What a great way to get us started here, because now we've not only gone, Nick said, I'm 75 years old. Now we've gone to Gurmahar. She's the youth vote there in India, but she's also brought us this international perspective, which is incredibly important because, you know, here we are in the US, half the time we are just watching pictures of Zuck and Dorsey giving testimony in front of Congress, and it makes you think, wow, what are we doing in the US to tackle this problem? But it is such, this information, misinformation, it knows no national boundaries. And we all know that. And so Gurmahar, your global perspective, thank you for injecting that into the conversation. So I want to double down now. I really want to go down into each of your stories. I think everybody understands we've got some really diverse perspectives here. Nick, can I come right back to you and ask you, you sort of intimated you'd been in the hot seat. I know you were in the hot seat, waking up one day and suddenly find you're targeted for a serious fake news disinformation campaign. Let me turn it back to you to describe that, your reaction, your thoughts to that. We'll talk about solutions later, but let me just ask you to kind of pick up the narrative.
Thanks, Sheldon. So I'll not talk about solutions later, and I'll not talk about other related issues, but let me just focus on my problem. Quite right. I mean, you can talk about this all you want, and perhaps it's happened to several of the other people on the panel or the people listening. But when it happens to you, it's quite different. When you wake up one morning and you see that someone has designed a program to literally take you out, it's purposed. And unfortunately, it's a program that has relative degrees of credibility in it. So, you know, the person put together a story that had correct information, a lot of misinformation, and then ultimately the disinformation. The objective of the slander, of the slur, or whatever you want to call it, or the campaign, and it was a campaign because it lasted for several weeks. I mean, I think from beginning to end, it lasted about 6 weeks with several articles, was to get rid of me. So it was very simple. The person wanted me to be removed from the Peace Tech Lab board and wanted me fired. We never fully, in the sense of the law, figured out who it was, but we had a good idea who it was and why they were doing this. And along the way, they not only tried to take me out, they tried to take out several organizations that I was associated with. So they went back to my alma mater. They went to some other relationships I had with other people. And of course, the Peace Tech Lab was greatly implicated. It was scary, just to be totally, brutally candid with you. I'm a single person here. If it weren't for the fact that Sheldon and his people are so savvy in what goes on, we'd still be fighting that fire. They smoke jumped in, literally started to monitor the web. We were fortunate. We had a wonderful legal firm do pro bono work for us and engage here on this topic. We ultimately shut them down. Took 6 weeks. We wrote lots of letters to lots of people. By the way, they were very manipulative in the way they did things, in the sense that they'd open up a server in the UK, then they'd open up a server in India. So they were pretty crafty people. And by the way, I'm not going to give you a lot of the details here because I hope we don't have bad people listening to this work, but we may. So I'm not going to explain to you how you do all this. But I have to tell you, probably didn't cost this person. It probably did not cost this person $500 to do this. 6 weeks of intense work. Frightening. Very, very frightening to me. I didn't know what I was going to be able to do. And then to complicate my life, not to bore you with this, and I think this person knew this, I had to then self-report because they were accusing me of a crime. They were accusing me of being an unregistered lobbyist. And I had to self-report myself to all the boards that I'm on, and I had to self-report myself to the US government because I hold a clearance with them. And this person or these people knew all of this. They knew even if they didn't get me removed, they would make my life miserable for as long as they could. I have to say it was a true wildfire. And if it weren't for, I'll say it again, if it weren't for Sheldon and his team and the legal help we got, and my son's a lawyer and he jumped in as well as did other friends of mine. I mean, the more this went on, the more people I had to tell about what was happening to me because the stories became more and more ludicrous. In terms of, this is what happens when you're telling lies. They become bigger lies. I mean, so if that lie didn't work, then they're going to tell another lie. And if that lie doesn't work, then they're going to tell another lie. And they're going to continuously turn you into, the miserable person that they would like the world to believe you are. Here we are in the United States of America, right? We're not in, some struggling economy. We're not in a developing environment, but they use all the tools of their trade. And unfortunately, the tools of our trade on the side of good are the tools of their trade on the side of bad. And that's the challenge, to be honest with you, of technology. Having developed a lot of this technology and nurtured a lot of this technology, it's not ever intended to do bad. Very few things in history could you ever say were developed for the purpose of destruction or bad. The internet was not one of them. That is not what it was all about. And if you really, kind of get your head wrapped around it, the next thing on the horizon for us is AI, artificial intelligence, and the data sources. It's the data source that is always the issue. Somebody said it earlier, you used the words velocity and variety and volume. Well, it's the veracity of the data source as well, my friends. And we have no real way to test the veracity of the data source. And if we did, my incident would not have happened. Just to be blunt with you, people would have refused to have done what they were being paid to do. So let me stop there, Sheldon.
Nick, can I ask you a question? You reminded me just now of, how you have been part of the birth. You were there, essentially the birth of the technology world in which we live. You 45 years with IBM, you led their innovation work when social media companies were being born. And I'm just wondering if you'd reflect for a second here, did IBM and the other big tech companies at the time that you were working with, Intel, Cisco, as you were watching the social companies come online, I'm wondering, did you foresee any of these problems? I mean, what were you thinking? I mean, that's when we were sowing the seeds of the problem that you just were a victim of. I'm very curious to get your sort of historical reflection.
Sure. Great question. And I'm not trying to take credit where credit isn't due, but at least in my world, my part of IBM, the answer is yes. We actually did foresee this. We actually did thoroughly understand. Don't think that the smart technical people are stupid. They are very broad-based thinkers. They actually do understand the consequences of their actions, intended and unintended. For years, we pushed that the opposite side of security was privacy. And one of the things that we need more of are privacy tools, like we have security tools. And we've been slow. The market's been slow. The industry's been slow to give you those privacy. I know I'm involved in several initiatives working on, the ability to bona fide yourself, the ability to have the veracity of Phil Howard. So anything else that's been said is baloney. If it doesn't have Phil Howard's chop on it, it's not Phil Howard. so you can't believe it. So yes, Sheldon, we did understand it. The market's been slow to pick it up. There's markets been, for whatever reason, maybe we can incite, a good riot here. I'm all for doing, being involved in good trouble, and this is good trouble because it's going to take a rude awakening without violating, net neutrality, without violating the privileges that you talked about earlier, associated with the positive changes, the ability to protect freedom of speech, the ability to protect your anonymity. There are ways to do all of this. It's just no one's been pushed to the brink to do it. So maybe with this august crowd here, where we can kind of go from pillar to post, we can stitch together a story. But yes, Sheldon, don't ever allow anyone to say that they didn't understand the consequences of their actions. That's just not acceptable. Or in plain English, maybe this isn't allowed on the airway, it's bullshit.
Speaking truth to power, as always. Thank you, Nick. And you mentioned there the freedom of expression dilemma. And I think I want to go to Gurmahar here, because Gurmahar, you were also on the receiving end, I think, of massive disinformation, misinformation attacking you personally. It was a little bit different. Nick just woke up one day and had an effort was underway to dismantle a distinguished 50-year career, having worked with presidents around of R's and D's, and an effort to take him down out of nowhere. Whereas you were getting a lot of attention for your views in India. You were a campaigner for free expression. So I'd love to hear your perspective on this question of, the internet needs to be protecting free expression, but at the same time, you were really a victim of some horrible, dangerous attacks. So let me turn it over to you to describe how you would see the problem set. Got to unmute yourself. Sorry, you need to unmute. Perfect.
Thank you so much, Sheldon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think there's always this debate about anonymity for activists under authoritarian and military rule and dictatorships. And for me, I think that is that's and within our activist circles within India, we've always thought about it. We've always considered it. But for me, that's always a very separate discussion. It's been a very separate discussion from. It's just been a very separate discussion from, whether the best solution to have a free and open, whether the best solution to this problem is to have a free and open internet to address governments that jeopardizes a citizen safety, which is something that happened with me, in particular, because what happened with me was a party-sponsored attack, was party-sponsored misinformation campaign. But but I don't want to focus on just the debate of anonymity, and instead focus that even if there is anonymity, it will never prevent it won't prevent governments or malicious actors from going one level below miscommunication or one level below communication to the infrastructure and simply shutting it down, whether it's shutting down the internet, as we have recently seen in countries like Iran, and especially in India, in Kashmir, after 5th August, when the current government revoked Article 370s. And this is also something we see in China all the time. And all these different type of cyber attacks, some of which affects free speech and communications, they need to be discussed more. In an original research report for Digital Peace Now that we commissioned this year, we found out that there is this growing awareness and alarm for cyber attacks of all kinds. In India, 89 in India, in my country, 89% people are very aware of the threat that we are under. In the States, I believe it's 87. And yet, we've noticed that if you ask these people about cyber attacks, whether it's from if you ask them to name cyber attacks, they wouldn't know it. So I feel like I feel like we have reached a moment where we need to find a solution within, grassroots activists, paired with government officials and private organizations, which controls this infrastructure, that this infrastructure we use to band together to create a globally applicable, solution to the problem that we're facing.
Thank you.
And
Yes. So that speaks to that point we were talking about earlier, making sure that we have the right people around the table as the changes are being discussed. I think you're absolutely right. We are at a unique moment where change is afoot, and I think that's a great segue to Phil. Phil, we talked about where you're working, but we didn't talk about your latest product, your book, Lie Machines,
Right.
How to Save Democracy from Troll Armies, Deceitful Robots, Junk News Operations, and Political Operatives. What an amazing title, first and foremost. I'm not a shill for Phil's book. I get no cut of Phil's book, just letting you know. But anybody who cares about this topic is going to want to read Phil's book, and then you won't sleep for several days. Because
Thank you.
he catalogs so seriously, so truly the magnitude of the problem. I wanted to tee up Nick's story and I wanted to tee up Gurmahar's story because they're very personal stories. These folks are the individuals that represent the face of the attacks, but Phil has done a great job of capturing the order of magnitude at a kind of a global, national community level. So Phil, having done that, having captured the riveting stories of misinformation, whether it's Cambridge Analytica or whether it's fake dating profiles that are used in order to convince young people to vote a certain way, I want to hear how you define the problem that we should be solving for, right? We talked a little bit about, is this built into the system, the architecture of the internet, because of that anonymity that is allowed to people attacking the Nicks and the Gurmahars? Is it inevitable? Or is this the problem really about human nature, evil people that are spreading disinformation? And I realize these things are not mutually exclusive, but I just want to hear how you think about it.
Well, I think your instinct is right. It's both. And I define a lie machine as having both a social mechanism and a technical mechanism. So the social part involves the politicians who pay for this stuff, the teams that maintain large numbers of profiles, right? It takes people to do this work. The consulting firms who help in a number of countries around the world. It's governments retask entire military units to do social media manipulation. So there's definitely a social and organizational aspect to it. But then there's the technical side of it. And as Nick was saying earlier, there are several ways in which the information technologies are designed to allow people to express themselves choosing whatever identity they want. And that can be wonderful. That's also the mechanism by which you express junk news, right? And hide your identity. So there's a social mechanism in that people pay for this stuff. There's a business behind it. It's a technical problem in that in the 2 or 3 days before people vote, Facebook and Twitter serve up large amounts of misinformation to voters just at the moment they need good information to make their decisions, right? And so this social mechanism, this technical mechanism, is put into the service of some lie. For the most part, the last couple of years, when we've been studying what we call computational propaganda, right? So the stuff that's really big scale, we've been working on elections, because elections are, the big money moments where an entire political party or a whole set of lobbyists will pay for this stuff. In the last 6 months, it's been about COVID misinformation, also involving the same kinds of teams, but in this case, it's COVID misinformation that makes people expose themselves to more risk. There's evidence that it's resulting in fatalities, right? The misunderstanding of the public health risks, taking things that aren't cures and treating them as cures, that has serious implications for lives and livelihood. So, overall, the stuff is organizationally directed. Somebody's got a strategy and a target group. They have hiring plans and performance bonuses, and there's receptionists and office space and rent. I mean, these are formal organizations, right? These aren't lone wolf operations. These are formal organizations, and it's emotional rather than rational. It's about provoking some kind of action for the sponsors, the people who pay for it.
Phil, I got to follow up. There's a subtext to a lot of what you said, which comes down to the word profit, right? I've got to ask you, Phil, if we haven't talked, and it seems to me we're not talking enough these days about that profit motive here. And I don't mean profit motive of the people that are spreading the misinformation. I mean the profit motive of the tech companies themselves who get paid for clickbait. As long as you have a situation where the algorithm incentivizes the rise to the top of the most salacious material, that which is getting clicked on, the nightmare material that Nick and Gurmahar were kind of alluding to. As long as that, if you required a change in that business model, I do not underestimate the complexity of doing that. But I want to ask you, would we be able to, instead of having digital wildfires, maybe they'd be digital campfires? Like, we always know that people are going to be, there's people that are going to be hurling inaccuracies, misinformation all the time. But again, this is algorithmically stoked. That's the fuel of this thing. Can I ask you to just comment on that profit element to this and in this conversation?
Happy to. And I think there's two sides of it. Two sides to the profit motive here. We just had a colleague return from fieldwork in Poland. He was spending time with a lab that maintains 40,000 fake Facebook profiles. And the number one clients for these labs are not politicians. They're pharmaceuticals firms. And these firms will hire 10,000 Facebook users to have trouble dealing with their migraines. And then they'll hire 10,000 others to have a new medicine for managing migraines. And they have an interaction out in public space that people see. This is the structure that's largely been developed for marketing, goods, right? Consumer electronics, pharmaceuticals. And that's the same stuff that's being used, same system that's being used to market political ideas. I think Facebook and Twitter don't actually make that much money from the trolls and the Russian government taking out ads. They don't make a lot of money from that. But I do think that they have designed a system that rewards polarization and conflict and disagreement. And that means that we could imagine another system that would reward civic engagement or consensus building, right? Or points of agreement, right? Those could rise to the top rather than the content that's all capital letters, lots of potty mouth words and exclamation marks. But that we didn't build that system.
Yeah. Wow. That is very helpful. And I think also takes us into the different the different world of the end user in which I think Michelle lives. And I find the conversation, to be honest with you, almost invariably under invests in that end user piece. And I'd love to get your perspective on that, Michelle. At namely, you work to empower people with the awareness and the skills to engage more critically with the kinds of stuff that Phil is telling us is coming our way like a tsunami. This is what you do at Namely, is try to educate folks to be smarter how to do that. So how much of this problem that we're talking about should be the responsibility of the end user? How much do we owe to our, if you will, our own psychology and the way we interact with media and news platforms, social media, tech? Love to get your perspective.
I would love to give it. So this is perfect. I really appreciate that I am on this panel because I often think that what is missing from some of these high-level conversations about mis and disinformation is the education piece. And I'm not saying that education will solve all our problems, and media literacy education is certainly not a panacea, but I don't know how we do this long-term without addressing systemic change in our education systems. And that's not just in the US, that's globally. I'm not entirely sure what we are preparing the next generation for if we are not giving them these skills that they need to not just survive, but thrive and lead the next, the next generation. So I think that there is no doubt that the user has some responsibility as users of technology, as people that opt in to be part of a participatory culture. It is a personal responsibility to act responsibly, to seek out learning opportunities, to, understand the technological landscape, and to stay informed, right? We have to commit to staying empowered. We have to take control where we can take control and be hypervigilant about the accounts we follow, the platforms we're on, the news we consume, the messages we share. We do have a role to play. And if we are going to be part of that complicated system, then we should do our part in ensuring the system stays healthy. With that said, man, it's an uphill battle for the individual, right? I mean, we are going up against powerful tools and incredibly influential companies that we've already talked about that are the wizards behind the curtain, right? And that battle can't be solved by one individual, right? And these are complex problems and they deserve complex solutions. And that means there's a piece for the user, there's a piece for the government, there's a piece for the companies, there's a piece for our cybersecurity arms of government. This is a multi-stakeholder problem, which deserves a multi-stakeholder solution. And I just want to say that what troubles me is when education is not part of that stakeholder conversation. And that, I think, is because education is the long game. You can't just change the education system, and we are fighting that hard in the states. We have 50 different state education departments to kind of show the urgency of this skill building. But I really feel that we have to at least arm the citizens with the skills they need to at least understand all the complex parts of this ecosystem, and teach them about all the things you're talking about, Sheldon, when it comes to the power structures and the algorithms and the profit motive, all of that. That's my language. That's all media literacy education. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a like I said, it's a big problem, and we need to be having these types of conversations. And just to say one more optimistic thing, because I come from a different point of view. I spend a lot of my time on the really good part of the internet, and all in the civic engagement. I get to see youth media, and I get to see teachers working with students, and I get to see the opposite of a lot of what other people are seeing on the internet, right? The positives. And I think that we have to recognize that these are really powerful tools, and that there is a lot of evidence that they can be used for really creative, positive community building. And so we have to look at how that is successful while we look at the unfortunate parts of it too. And just to recognize that, in 2016, certainly in the US, people were stunned that Facebook took our data. Like, that was 4 years ago. And the amount of progress we have made in these 4 years to start addressing the problem, to start at least asking the right questions, is phenomenal to me. I mean, I'm telling, in 2016, people were stunned about the ad process in social media platforms. We're having much deeper conversations now. And so I feel optimistic that at least we're on the right path.
Well, I'm super glad to hear you say that, Michelle. You struck me where we live in the Peace Tech Lab, which is all about amplifying the power of technology for positive social change. But I don't want to leave you just yet when you're talking about the problem we've got of educating the consumer. I just want to, it's so interesting that you ended on the progress we've made with the social companies and getting them to be more transparent, having the data discussion since 2016. But I want to know, how do you think we're doing in terms of this challenge of education, of getting the system to understand? I mean, look, you're competing against a system where everybody says we need more education about health among our youth. Mm-hmm. We need more education about, I know when I ask my 20-some-year-old daughters about what they thought was missing in their education, it's not help me understand how to be safe online. Right. What they say is, it's about, nobody ever told me about financial literacy. Mm-hmm. Nobody taught me about mortgages or interest and all. Like, I really feel like that was a big missing part of my education. How are we doing now with this idea of media literacy being recognized by the educational establishment as being as vital as you say it is?
Well, I would say that there are pockets of brilliance. And this I'm saying globally, like, this is, we work, even though we're a US based organization, a third of our members are global because, again, we're situated in the community building space, and this community is global. So we see really, really strong practice. There's really strong practice. There's strong curriculum. There's strong teacher training, but is nowhere, and certainly in the US, it is not a national priority. And what is a struggle is that you don't have to fight for people to understand the urgency of it, but you do have to figure out how to get it into the classroom. And the way you do that, and the way we have to think about media literacy education, is that it's not a subject to teach. It's a way to teach. It's cross-discipline. There's a reason the word literacy is in it. Like, literacy is taught across curriculum, across subject area, and media literacy should be the same thing. Media literacy skill building has its place in the science classroom, the math classroom, the social studies, the English, the arts. It can be done in really creative ways through the subject areas that are already required and already mandated. And my organization just launched a National Media Literacy Alliance with 12 other national teacher organizations covering all the main core subject areas, because we recognize that we're not going to scale media literacy thinking of it like it's a separate class. Like, we need teacher training. But to go back to your question, we aren't doing enough to make it systemic, right? And that, I say we as in the whole entire globe. There are definitely pockets, and there's some really good work in different countries, especially in Europe, and some stronger work in certain states. But ultimately, we need funding and we need support for that teacher training so that teachers can integrate it into their subject areas and their assessments that are already mandated.
All right, I hope we'll come. But when we talk, we're now going to start to talk solutions, folks. And I hope, Michelle, when we come back to talking solutions, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the way you talked about it, not as a subject, not as its own curriculum, but rather a cross-discipline kind of way of teaching media literacy. I've never heard it positioned that way, how it should be part of science, how it should be part of your English. I'd love to hear a little bit more of that when we start to talk about the solution set. And that's where I want to go now, folks, because it can be a pretty bleak picture when we talk about the nature of the problem. And I want to jump now to the nature of the solutions. And I want to do this. Look, it's a ginormous topic. I want to break it into two pieces. I want us to talk about it from an organizational institutional perspective, which kinds of gets us into regulatory issues. You know, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 2 years about the responsibility of government. There's been a lot of discussion about the responsibility of the tech companies. I'd like to get each of you to share your views on this public versus private sector responsibility. Initially, and then we'll go to what folks on this call, what folks in this audience can be doing themselves to be digital smoke jumpers. But I want to begin with kind of the institutional framework and get your perspectives on that. Let me also say to folks who have been listening for the last hour, thank you very much, that we're going to try to make some time at the very end here for questions. So be thinking about the questions you'd like to put into the chat box for this this panel. So let me go back up to you, Nick. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what we should be doing about this thing, because you have certainly seen it all when it comes to regulatory frameworks, when it came to public-private, you know, it's the tech company versus the government. I'd really love to get your perspective, Nick.
Sure, thank you. And by the way, just an amazing set of stories from my panelists here. So a very interesting session, very helpful. Thank you all. Hey, look, let's be realistic about this. There's no one at fault here other than ourselves, just to be totally candid with you. It's our lack of understanding. It's our lack of education. As Michelle said, it's our lack of knowledge. I still hear this too much on boards, many boards that I'm on. Well, you're the cybersecurity person. That's just nonsense. You all should be cybersecurity people. You should all be technology people. It's like having me join a board and saying, well, it's perfectly all right. You do not understand, dollars, cents. You don't understand how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. It's perfectly fine that you don't know that, as long as you know this. So, Michelle hit a nerve ending with me. I'm a T-shaped education proposer. The T-shaped model is what we need. The I-shaped model is what we have. And, if you follow the I-shaped model to its end, you become a PhD in one thing that nobody knows anything about. I mean, so here you are with the best degree that you're ever going to have is probably your high school degree, because it's probably the broadest degree you're going to have. And then we proceed to hammer you into like an I. That's not wise. We need Renaissance people. We need people who are very broad in perspective. So there's power in who we are. Please don't blame technology. I've been part of review after review. Most of you might not even remember. Some of you weren't even born when the eBay denial of service attack happened. One of the very first frustrating, technology, attacks being used on an e-commerce site. I was called to the White House at that point in time when Clinton was president. And my question from him was, should we redesign the internet, Mr. D'Onofrio? Is it wrong? And my answer was, Mr. President, there's nothing wrong with the internet. Everything is wrong with us, in the way we use it. And then I used the now famous, have you ever seen a briefcase with the combination lock on it. We all have had one in our lives. I've had several. Those combination locks are all set to what number, Mr. President? 0, 0, 0, 0. And most people, 80% of the people of the world, never change that combination lock. And that's exactly what's wrong with technology. You know, you get it the way it is, you apply it the way it is, and you never tailor it to your needs. You never use it for the purpose that it was intended to. So you can blame a lot of things, but the biggest blame here is really ourselves. And I'm going to pick on something Phil said, and the realization, and this is hard to say, and I'm not anti-patriotic, the governments of the world are working in the opposite direction. They are the culprits. They are the ones who are kind of using this disinformation, misinformation, you know, to their advantage. They're putting holes in the technology. You know, they're looking for unfair advantage. Don't ever be naive. Everything you buy, you should question, because there's a good chance that it has a hole in it somewhere, and that someone's going to use it to their advantage. To Michelle's point, start to be this educated person. You don't have to know how to do it. You do not have to know how to do it to be able to articulate and discuss it. And the last point I'm going to make, because you did ask this about enterprises, not governments, but enterprises. Look, we have a massive ESG movement in this country. The financial institutions are jumping all over it. You know, all of the major stockholders like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, they own the bulk of the portfolio of trading companies right now, in this country at least. ESG is a powerful movement. We got to get this topic, Michelle, on the ESG agenda. We have to find a way, when they talk about social, this is part of social. That's what's wrong in my mind. Sheldon, you get that force behind it, you watch how well-behaved Facebook becomes, Twitter becomes, Google becomes, and everybody, and I'm not trying to insult anybody, you watch how they change their behavior. I'll stop here.
So Nick very clearly articulate at every level. He's in a few minutes. He's taken us from individual to corporate to government. Everybody owns this problem. Gurmahar, thank you. I'm glad you got back on. I saw you had some internet problems there in India. We are so grateful to have you being able to join us from India. If you can unmute yourself and just give us a little bit of your perspective now on what you think should be done. You talked a lot before about we have a unique moment. We have a chance to do some good work in this area. What does it look like?
Thank you so much, Sheldon, for having me back, and apologies to everyone for my broken internet. So I think we need to answer your question. We need to understand what is the main purpose of dis and misinformation. So when governments or bad actors generate and distribute misinformation, they seek to. There's a certain aim. They seek to create confusion and chaos in order to hamper momentum of the communities and mobility, and cause communities to think differently. So what we have in hand right now is a multi-layered problem, and all multi-layered problems need multi-layered solutions. So we solve this problem, you know, when media calls out the bad actors for misusing digital channels to spread confusion. We solve this problem, you know, when government enshrines in legislation that co-opting digital mediums and communication tools and turning them into weapons as illegal, and have that law enforced, and then we solve this problem, you know, as a global community, by holding these institutions, by holding governments, by holding these people accountable. We call them by their name. We refuse to do business with them. You know, we call out these bad actors. We put pressures on candidates. and we ask them to give us a peaceful internet. And there's so many examples of this method in practice at the organization at Digital Peace now. We have a newsletter, we have Twitter spreading out information, we have events, but as people and as communities, we need to educate, and then we need to take action. We need to move from education to action.
I think I got a note here from Michelle who'd like to respond directly to that. And I understand why, since you were really, really leaning on the education piece. Michelle, go for it.
Yeah, I really appreciated your points. And I just want to add that I think this is part of, sometimes I have a problem when we talk about mis and disinformation, because information is not binary. And I think sometimes we get into this space where we want to put information into buckets that are, this is fact and this is fiction. And it's much more complicated than that. And beyond that, what I want to make sure to stress is that we might not be doing as good a job as we can on combating misinformation and disinformation and understanding the motives and all of that. But I would argue that we're not even doing that good a job with information in general. And I think that we are so focused on mis and disinformation because can be the most dangerous. But we have to recognize that even if we figure out this problem, even if Facebook and Twitter, and we just figure out how to, handle all of this and combat this, most information out there still needs to be understood. And I just want to put that out there, that understanding the information landscape is not just about mis and disinformation. There is a lot of information out there that doesn't fall into those categories. And we need to be cognizant about that also, and asking questions, not just about the mis and disinformation, about all information.
Yeah, and Sheldon, I hate to do this because I'm out of order, but that's who I am.
We've taken over.
Membership has its privileges, Mr. Chairman.
No, I mean, Michelle got me started here, as did Gurmar. Look, you have to also remember that we're dealing with a population of the world that has never been this multi-generational before. I mean, we have baby boomers living side by side with Gen Zs and soon Gen AA's. They all see this differently, to Michelle's point. They're all going to need to be approached. I see Phil's nodding. We're going to have to educate them differently. Some of them are just not going to ever want to deal with any of this. And some of them are going to know it better than we, because it's going to be, this is how they were born. This is how they came to life. And I don't think we can forget that point, Sheldon.
No.
Multi-generational is going to require us to take a multi-faceted approach to get this where we want it to be. I'll stop here.
Nick, no. Great point, Nick. Anybody who's heard me speak about the importance of multi-generational, there's a great Intel study done about 10 years ago that showed how people under 25, people over 25 ring the doorbell with their forefinger. People under 25 on average ring the doorbell with their thumb. Why is that? Because they've been texting and the dominant digit is changing. So absolutely, that really makes the point to me about how generational perception varies in this. But you know what? We all need to get smarter about what we consume. We all need to be better educated. Michelle, the nuances of information, I'm all over it, yes. But what worries me is the violence that I'm seeing perpetrated on the internet around the world. The fact that you can take down somebody's entire career with a set of lies. I'm worried about these most flagrant, worst violations and what they cause in communities. And I want us to talk about specifics here. Phil, I want to go to you because you've thought a lot about this at the Oxford Internet Institute. And you know what? Given the world we live in technologically, given the fact that deep fakes are here to stay, given this cat and mouse game that we always have in the technology, and it is going to be, there's no possible way that if we say, you know what, Facebook is really doing a great job of taking stuff down, and Twitter has got its own system for taking stuff down, and Google's got its own system. It does not seem to me that it is possible to create an environment where we are going to globally trust the information that we need to solve problems like climate change or global pandemics. So, Phil, talk to me about the regulatory ideas that have been on the table. The idea of creating a WTO version of for the internet. I've heard ideas around the IPCC for climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. I've heard ideas about we need one of those. We need to start with that in order to know actually where are we in this problem? How bad is this problem? How do we measure this problem? Sorry, right. I'm going on way too long, but I know you thought a lot about this stuff.
Sheldon, it's a big batch of questions, and I guess fundamentally I agree with Gurmahar, Nick, and Michelle that education is the media training, is the long-term intergenerational strategy. I wouldn't want us to let the technology firms off the hook, though. I do think that they have diverted a significant revenue flow that used to go to local news, used to go to local civil society groups, and it now goes to Silicon Valley. Almost every country in the world has civil society groups who do fact-checking. The idea that civil society should be responsible for fact-checking Facebook is inane, right? That's not what civil society should be doing. So there must be ways of redirecting the revenue flow that now accrues to a handful of firms in Silicon Valley. And I think the fix has to be, since the problem is both technical and institutional, the fix has to be technical and institutional. And I think the real challenge for our democracy is that the best data about public problems and public life is not in the public realm anymore. It's not in the libraries. It's not in the Library of Congress. It's not in the British Library. It's not in the national libraries. It's on the western side of Washington State in secure server cloud farms. It's in Silicon Valley. And so whatever solution we come up with has to sort of break that monopoly of information about public life. Now, I'm a fan of the UN system, but I don't think we should peg our hopes to a UN level body on this kind of problem. I think that's too distant. For me, the important technical solution is a possibility and has been around for a while, and it's effectively an idea that came out of the Blood Diamonds campaign 30 years ago, right? The Blood Diamonds campaign was fairly straightforward. If you could tell a consumer that the diamond they were looking at came from the nastiest pits of Africa, slave mines, most consumers, most of the time, would not buy that diamond. I think we should be able to look at any kind of technology that we bring into our household, our phone, our refrigerator, our television, and ask it to tell us who's benefiting from the data we generate. That's a very basic request. Which lobbyists, which parties, which technology firms are making use of the stuff we're giving up? And right now, technologies can't even do that. But let's say you could do that. That's a technical and an institutional fix. Because the next logical demand is, well, if I can see that there's 30 firms playing with my behavioral data, maybe I can add a civic group that I want to support. I would, for example, I would share my data with COVID health researchers if I could, if I thought it would help, if they said it would help. I have no means of expressing myself civically through data, and somehow we have to create that pathway.
We're going to go to the wisdom of the crowd here in a minute with some questions, but I just want Nick, having been part of that enterprise machine for so long, I'm wondering whether you have any reaction to Phil's suggestion, which is requiring this degree of transparency, it seems like that he's suggesting
Sure.
needs to be part of the architecture.
Yep. So, I mean, Phil and I don't know each other other than this introduction, but we're kindred spirits, Phil. So, amen. So, if you need a technology buddy to help you, I'm here for you, pal. So, look, it's sad in many ways as I've been reflecting on all of these conversations, because heck, it was back in 2005, 2006 that the real run in corporations around the world was everybody had a privacy officer. Everybody had a chief privacy officer. You don't hear that anymore. That they have chief digital officers. I mean, they have a lot of other chiefs, but they've kind of let that slip away. And if you believe my thesis that says technologists actually do understand the consequences of their actions, they do understand the intended and unintended consequences. It's not a far reach for what Phil's asking for, Sheldon, to say, you know what? Just like you put labels on goods that you buy, you should have a label on the thing that you buy that says this could be dangerous for your health in the following ways, or this could be dangerous for your privacy in the following ways. That's not a bridge too far, and that's not an overreach. And before we go to the crowd, to complement all of this discussion, not to make you worry more or to make you angrier, but we haven't even touched on the fact that the world is AI mania crazy right now. Everything is machine language. Everything is natural language. What makes that work is what you should be asking yourself. That works because somebody has data about behaviors. And they're selling that data as if it were, okay, this is cause and effect. When people do this, they do that. And therefore, run that into your AI algorithm, and therefore you'll be making happier clients in some whatever way, shape, or manner. One of the things that you should worry about is the same bad people that do bad things with our privacy, our security. They're also very capable of doing bad things with your data. They can create synthetic data. They can create data that looks like you. This is what you should be worrying about, not just me being, taken down on the web, or you, Kumar, being taken down, or God forbid any of you. The fact of the matter is, you could feed enough data into these algorithms that you could get whatever answer you want, and you could influence whatever behavior you want, and you would never know it. You would never see it. Because it would be subtle changes over a long. If you want to worry about the future, if you want to ponder the imponderable, that's what I get upset about. Is this whole idea around synthetic data feeding those AI algorithms, on a regular basis. So, look, there's always a ditch on both sides of the road, and I think it's up to people like us, Sheldon, and Peace Corps, or PeaceCon, and everyone who's got an organization that's in and around this. I think it's up to us to kind of take the lead here and to kind of push this back. I said ESG before. I said the investment firms. Look at how well the banking industry does with technology. They can find bad actors in 5 seconds. They'll find that transaction and figure out that was a phony transaction and that you're money laundering. You mean we can't put that kind of technology to work on the problems that we're talking about? I doubt it. I'll stop.
But Nick, I want to push you. I just want to hear, you teed up a really, really disconcerting problem with AI that we're pretty familiar with. What kind of, it shouts to me the need for technical oversight in this process.
Right. So there's way you can develop technologies that speak to the veracity of the data, not just the volume and the variety, of the data, or the velocity of the data, which seems to be driving everybody nuts. But you have to question the veracity of the data.
Nick, my question to you is, who does this? The world cannot even agree. Is this a national problem where we toggle between regulatory and oversight and local oversight, or is this an international oversight body that supervises what you're talking about?
I think it's back to my T-shaped model. It's everybody. So we got to get back to the technology companies that are starting all of this, the people who use it in industry, the education system, the governmental system. I mean, first you got to get to recognize it. I mean, we have to have pretty loud voices here to stand up and speak on this. I mean, you're naive to think that government isn't synthesizing data and feeding it into these AI algorithms to get the results that they want. That's what you have to kind of step up to, Sheldon. So first you admit it. First you say, yes, that's true. That's happening. Now, what are we going to do about it? You know, and now that I know it, can I detect it? Sure. You want to give me, you know, just give me a little bit of time and a bunch of smart people, and we'll build you an algorithm that will test to the veracity of your data. That's what we should be calling for.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit because we got a great question from the crowd here, which I think takes us back to some. I mean, Nick, you did tee up education. Michelle Gumahar, you've been talking about this, but I think it's a really great one. This intergenerational issue, right? Somebody in the audience said, "Look, it's great that we want to educate the next generation of users, but how should we be thinking about educating older generations who are so key to policy, but who are also those that we find doing a lot of sharing of fake news and misinformation?" Michelle, thoughts about that? And then I'll ask you, Gumahar, to...
Well, I can say that is a great question, and it's also a question that's been directly on the minds of media literacy organizations, certainly since 2016, when we really discovered that the majority of fake news being spread around the 2016 election was done by 65-year-olds and older. And so what I can say on a positive note is that there have been a lot of interventions and a lot of organizations doing really, really strong work. I can certainly put some in the chat, but ASU's News Collab in Phoenix has an online course. PEN America, based in New York, does a lot of misinformation and disinformation workshops. So that's just two of many. So there is a concerted effort. The bigger point I want to make, though, is the question and the conversation about intergenerational, I guess, divide is another thing that needs to be addressed systemically within our society and within our education system. Like, we are no longer at a point where continuing education isn't essential. You know, we think of continuing education as, for some people, as they get older and things that they want to learn. But the truth is that technology is going to continue to change with the speed of light. Information is going to continue to come at us with like the speed of light. Social media is not going anywhere. And these changes are going to happen as we all grow older. And so what we need to address is, how do we deal with that on a community level? And certainly in the US, we're seeing a lot of really, really strong work in our public libraries, in our community centers, with our public media system. PBS is a huge, huge proponent of media literacy education and doing really good work in that space. So the conversation really has to be, how do we continue to train people as they get older outside of formal education on how technology changes, so that we can address some of the divides that we're already seeing?
I want to go to you, Gumahar, because we've got another question that I think speaks to your own personal experience. You know, you were the victim of a lot of sort of gender violence online, if you will. And we have a very good question in that area from the audience. But I want to say first to everybody, after Gumahar answers this question, what I'd like to do is to give the panelists the final word here. I'd like all of you to give your thoughts to the audience about how we, all of us as individuals, should be thinking about becoming digital smoke jumpers that are part of the solution and not the problem. And I know we've had a lot of strands of that in this conversation, but I want to close this out on an upbeat note with things that people can be doing. So, Gunnar, I want to read you this question that's come in here. how does misinformation, disinformation further impact marginalized groups, exacerbate the digital gender gap? And
Yeah.
what might be some solutions to reduce that harm? Do you have thoughts on this?
I think it's a brilliant question where we so far the entire conversation, the panel has addressed misinformation to misinformation that's spread to all genders, to all to all age groups. We've spoken about intergenerational education. I think what happens with women and particularly marginalized group, it's not, and I'm going to speak from the point of view of not the kind of misinformation is spread to the marginalized groups, but about the marginalized groups. Very recently, I mean, I have multiple examples. When we talk about gender, it's the kind of misinformation when it comes to female activists, female journalists, when it comes to female leaders or female voices, the kind of misinformation that is spread about these leaders or these voices in attempts to silence them are deeply gendered. They're sexist in nature. They attack the female body. They attack the female anatomy. And 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 that's the kind of attack that strips away a human being's dignity. It doesn't happen. It's not a it doesn't quite happen to men. It happens to female. It happens to marginalized groups, women groups. So I think what misinformation about marginalized groups does, it further silences women. It further it further it further puts a gag on 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 these voices that and further puts a gag on these voices, and then further instigating or sending out a signal that if there are anybody from these marginalized groups who would want to speak up, they would have to go through similar process of humiliation almost. And I think it's a deeply, when it comes down to marginalized groups and women, I think it's a deeply we go into a completely different, far more sensitive discussion.
I think you're exactly right about diagnosing the problem there, Gurmahar. But let me ask you, Phil, is this, picking up on Nick's point about AI, is this one of those areas where we actually might be getting better because AI can help us get better about detecting bias? I know we've had problems with bias in AI, but people seem to be waking up to that and how to retrain the models. What do you think, Phil?
I think there's hope there. So what Gurmahar has said is very important, in that for all the countries that we've studied, misinformation seems to be particularly effective against female journalists, prominent women politicians, feminist intellectuals. It's very easy to drive, unfortunately, it's very easy to drive women out of public life in many different parts of the world. And that's not something I think AI could help with in particular. And maybe one day, but that's also, I mean, it takes a lot of us to stand, it takes people to stand up to and technology firms to act up to prevent that sort of perversion of public life. I think sometimes when we think about the AI solution here, we often imagine that AI is something that will sit with technology firms. And we sort of want Facebook to have better AI, or to have better AI with more humans in the loop so that they make their decisions in smarter ways. I think it's possible to imagine that AI will be also more of a personal service. We may have our own AIs. Now, I don't know whether this will be good or bad for public life, but I would say that if it becomes possible to build AIs that would serve us as individuals, that might help promote, select high quality news sources, and maybe insist on some diversity in news sources, right? That might be good for public life. I think just assuming that the big technology firms will use AI in smart ways, I wouldn't leave it. I wouldn't leave it there. I think we're past the point of industry self-regulation, right? We're past that point.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. All right, folks, let's go around the horn here and close this out. If I may ask you, how can people in this audience, and thank you all. Let me just I want to first of all thank the audience for having been. We've had nearly every single person on this call from beginning to end, which is wonderful, and I think it also speaks to the quality of this extraordinary panel. And so thank you all for your mind share, for spending this time with us, and take us out on a positive note. How can we, each of us, become a digital smoke jumper? And by that I mean, how can we be better equipped to help reduce these wildfires of misinformation and disinformation that are truly, truly threatening our ability to tackle everything from future pandemics to global climate change, or even to have confidence in our local news? What should I be thinking about as what I can be doing? So, Michelle, let me go to you.
You can join my organization. It's free. And I highly recommend it because, and I put the link in the chat, it really is a community. And if you're interested in learning more about media literacy and staying on top of what we're doing and the research that is happening and the new curriculum and all of the new legislation, anything, please sign up. It's free. And then I would say, the media literacy community, we need to fund it. We need to fund research. We need to fund education. And if you are a parent or a teacher or someone that knows people in schools, we need to go to our schools and we need to ask them, what support are teachers getting in order to bring media literacy skills into the classroom? And we need to support our teachers in training and professional development. And I also gave you my email address because I love talking about this. I do it every day, all day long. So email me.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Nick, how about you?
Sure. I'm honored to be here. Thank you again for having me, and it's been just incredibly enlightening. Look, to give you a little bit of an uplifting thought here, it's all about you and your culture and your capacity for change. Change is the answer. Check in with yourself, find out what do you do with change? Do you avoid it? Do you embrace it? Do you welcome it? Do you lead it? And also drive yourself with a simple thought. Your value is not manifested in what you know. Going forward, your value manifests itself in what you do about what you don't know. You have to be a continuous learner. There's just no two ways about it because of change. Change is going to happen whether you like it or not. And it's not just technology that's changing. So much about who we are and what we think is changing. Gender is no longer a simple bipolar discussion. It's a spectrum. So if you think there's trouble now with women, how about all the people who are on the spectrum of gender? And what kind of trouble are they about to see or befall them? Put yourself into this mindset of change. We're living through it now with COVID. We're doing this conference this way, virtual versus real. It was kind of bipolar too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's now a spectrum. This is going to happen, my friends, over and over again. Get used to it. This is the way the world is going to evolve. Are you going to lead it? Or are you going to run from it? What you know has less to do about your value than what you do about what you don't know.
Great advice. Gurmahar, let me go to you. I know that's a tough one to follow, Gurmahar.
Yeah.
That's a hard act to follow.
Yeah. I think from where I am coming from, I think learn about the motivations behind misinformation and disinformation, because once those motivations become clear, it becomes way easier to spot information that's pretending to be the truth or fact. Again, like Michelle, I would also like to ask everyone to sign up for Digital Peace Now, our monthly newsletter. I would too put the link in the chat box. And our newsletter and our blogs, we talk about cyber attacks, we talk about the various forms it takes and the actors that are involved. So over time, the more we read about it, the more we learn, the more we educate ourselves, we will begin seeing patterns, and we will start spotting fake information way faster than we would have previously. And subsequently also not be duped into sharing information, that's secretly created out of thin air by like state-sponsored institutions trying to, hamper our free internet space for their own evil ends.
Excellent. Phil, final word here.
I would say, I want to say, as individuals, of course, always read stuff before we forward it. Right? That's something we can do as individuals, and we can teach others to do that consistently. I'm also going to drop my the book link into the chat with a discount code if you're still interested in this topic. But I would say, don't buy the book. Email me and I'll send you an electronic copy, and give the same amount to Digital Peace Now or the National Association for Media Literacy Education, because it's so much about engaging now with micro acts. And the worst thing we want for public life is any kind of withdrawal, or we don't want the Trump supporters to unfollow the Biden supporters. And in India, we don't want the different political factions to stop talking to each other at all. Trying to maintain that social fabric is part of what we have to do. I accept the cynicism of the situation that we're in, but not the fatalism. It's not too late to fix some of these big problems.
Excellent. Thank you, Phil. This has been a great discussion, folks. It's really reaffirmed. It's really reaffirmed how urgent and important these issues are. How important it is for us to stay attentive, responsible, proactive, as Nick said, continuous learners. We all have to be continuous learners, and we've got to, there's a lot of folks in this mix: consumers, creators, tech companies, government officials. This needs to be a collective effort, so we're going to have to, we've got a lot to do, is the last word from me. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Sheldon.
And my apologies to folks who sent in great questions and we didn't get to them, but thank you all for being on the call.
My pleasure. Good to be with you all.
Bye.
Bye, all.
Stay safe.
Stay safe, stay well, and stay nice.
Okay.